In this video, we're going to be talking about what are, in my opinion, the three biggest problems with the Caterpillar 3406E and C15 diesel engines. The Cat 3406E and C15 engines were some of the longest running, simplest, and reliable engines ever made. They could easily go over 1,000,000 miles between rebuilds, but just because they could doesn't mean they didn't have any problems. And in this video, we're going to be discussing what, in my opinion, are the three biggest problems with them. Biggest problem number 3 is spacer plate oil leaks. This is a nearly ubiquitous problem on these engines, whether it's a 3406E, C15, or ACERT C15. And what you're looking at here is the spacer plate area under the cylinder head between the engine block. If you look closely, you can see small oil bubbles pushing out under the spacer plate. Here's the same picture or video zoomed in. Do you see the bubbles? That's actually oil that's trying to get back to the oil pan, but it's being forced out. Now, the culprit for this is what they call the spacer plate gasket. Now, it's basically, it sits under the spacer plate here, and it's just a 14 thousandths thick steel piece of metal. It's not really a gasket. However, it's supposed to seal against the engine block, and it does a very poor job of that. You can see the spacer plate here, and then, of course, the head gasket is above the spacer plate. That's where the head gasket is. And the spacer plate is under the spacer plate gasket. Now, there have been various fixes from Caterpillar, and the most recent one was a update to put aviation gasket sealant on the spacer plate gasket. And even while doing this, you can still possibly get leaks from this area. It has helped significantly, but it's still an issue with these engines. Now, the biggest problem number 2 is the overhead and rocker arm designs. Now, this is actually two different problems. On the 3406Es and the early model C15s with a single turbo, it was mostly a rocker arm design issue. And the problem with the rocker arms are they're not strong enough for the valve train. And you can see the rocker arms here. This is the intake, and the other one is the exhaust one that was pointing out to before. And what happens is, at times, the rocker arms will actually break between the camshaft and the valve bridge. And you can see, this is an underside view of the rocker arms. You can see the rocker on the left has actually had a rather rare failure of the button that goes to the valve bridge is actually snapped off. But if you look on this exhaust rocker here, you can actually see that the casting is rather thin. There's not a lot of metal. And there's a tremendous amount of force being applied to this area on the rocker arm caused by the valve springs and opening the valves. Repeated stress on this can crack them. Now, when they went to the 2-turbo C15 ACERT design, they made the rocker arms thicker, and they did not have the rocker arm break issues as much. However, they had a much bigger problem now, because what they made were, instead of bolts, they had threaded studs that held the jake and rocker arm shafts in place instead of bolts from before. Now, these studs, while they are strong, there's an issue in that the rocker arm shaft sits in a cradle in the cylinder head. You can see the wear indicator marks from where the shaft was sitting in the head here. And over time, the shaft will wear into the head, and it'll cause a very small gap. And what happens is, when that gap is formed, the bolts can then loosen up. And once the bolts loosen up, well, then you're not holding the rockers and the jake housings in place, and you start to get some rocking action in them, and you can get this: broken IVA/jake housings, broken rocker shafts. The bolts can break off in the head. You might have to get a new cylinder head, new fasteners. Now, Cat has a couple design fixes. The main one they push is an updated bolt design. The bolt on the left is the updated design. The bolt on the right in that picture is the older design. Now, you can see that this has had a catastrophic failure. This will be a few $1,000s to fix. Now, this engine had the updated bolt design, and mainly the difference is just there's an area grooved out on the bolts. Now, you can see on the shaft here that the shaft has been wearing into the head quite heavily. And here are the broken bolts. Now, as you can see, these are the updated design. They have the small area, the relief area, machined out. These bolts are expensive. They're about $60 each. The IVA housing's about $1,200, and the rocker shaft's a couple $100. So rather expensive repair just because of the updated bolt design. Number one biggest problem with the 3406E and C15 design is head gasket failures. Now, it's not an actual design problem with the head gasket itself. However, I don't like how the head gasket has the head gasket, the spacer plate, shim, water ferrules, and O-rings. Most Cat engines just have a head gasket. The issue is with the engine block design itself, not the head gasket. We'll be discussing that why here. You can see that the fire rings blow out, and the reason for that is your liners, or the cylinders. So as you can see on the 3406 and the C15, the liners actually sit in the engine block, just like a C13 or an ISX Cummins. However, the liner actually rests on the block, opposed to it kind of being pressed in like on a C13. And this creates an issue. What you're looking at here is what they call a liner protrusion or liner projection sheet. And what this does is it measures the amount that the liner sticks out of the spacer plate with it installed in the engine block. And this is a critical measurement. It needs to protrude either between 3.5 or 6 thousandths if you're going to be doing counterbores, which we'll be discussing shortly. And if it doesn't, you get what they call a sunk liner, which means the liner has worn into the engine block. Now these are what the counterbores are. You can see that there's a machined area out of the engine block, and then these 30 thousandths, 32 or 34 thousandths shims are installed to help get the liner height correct. Well, what happens is over time, the liner, even with these shims, will wear into the block. It will then lose that liner protrusion. It'll go from 3.5 to 2.5. Once it starts getting close to 0, you'll start getting this, which is a damaged head gasket. The combustion gases are passing past the fire ring and entering typically coolant passages. This will cause bubbles or compression gases in your cooling system. Now, once this starts happening, there's really no fix in a can or anything you can do outside of pulling the engine apart, removing the cylinder liners, cutting or adjusting your counterbores, because that damaged fire ring is typically going to turn into this if you leave it alone, and then you're going to have a huge mess. Now, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please click the like button and subscribe if you would. Thank you.